History remembers kings for their glory, but what if one was remembered for his depravity? In the heart of Spain, behind gilded palace doors, lived a man so twisted that even his allies whispered in fear. Ferdinand VII, a ruler whose lust for power was matched only by his perversions. But the true horror of his reign wasn't written in his laws. It was carved into the bodies and souls of those who could not fight back. What secret did this king hide? And why has history tried to bury the darkest chapters of his life? Tonight, you will discover a truth far more terrifying than legend. Spain, at the dawn of the 19th century, was a kingdom rotting from within. Its palaces gleamed with marble floors and chandeliers, yet beyond those golden gates lay streets, filled with hunger, whispers of rebellion, and the suffocating stench of decay. For centuries, Spain had been a global empire, stretching across oceans, consuming continents. But by the time Ferdinand VII drew breath, its strength was faltering, its glory a fragile mask hiding a festering wound. From the very beginning, Ferdinand's existence was steeped in privilege, corruption, and shadows. Born into a court obsessed with power, he was not raised as a child, but as an heir molded by fear and excess. The boy learned quickly that appearances mattered more than truth, that cruelty was more respected than compassion, and that secrets were the most valuable currency in the royal court. The palace corridors he roamed were not simply halls of marble and tapestry, they were echo chambers of betrayal. Ministers whispered in corners, servants bowed with trembling hands, and courtiers smiled through clenched teeth. Even as a boy, Ferdinand absorbed this poison. He discovered the thrill of domination, the quiet satisfaction of watching others bend before him. And in the shadows of this gilded prison, the seeds of his perversions were quietly planted. Spain itself was shifting under his feet. Once feared across the world, the empire had become a fractured shadow of its former self. Revolts brewed in its colonies. Foreign powers eyed it like vultures circling a dying animal, and within the kingdom, a deep divide tore through society. The elite clung to their wealth and power, while peasants and minorities bore the crushing weight of exploitation. The racism that structured Spanish society was not merely tolerated, it was institutionalized. Ferdinand grew up watching it unfold like theater, never questioning, only learning how to wield it for his own gain. The young prince's tutors, instead of teaching virtue or wisdom, taught obedience and paranoia. Every lesson was laced with warnings: never trust too deeply, crush your enemies before they rise, use fear to command loyalty. These teachings did not produce a leader of strength, they produced a tyrant in waiting, a boy who understood power, not as responsibility, but as a weapon to twist others to his will. And in the hidden chambers of the palace, Ferdinand's darker impulses began to bloom. Servants whispered of the cruel games he played, of how he delighted in watching others squirm, of how he tested the limits of what he could get away with. To the outside world, he was simply the heir, but within those walls, he was already something else, a predator learning the shape of his hunger. The Spain that Ferdinand would inherit was fractured, but he would make it far worse. His rule would not be remembered for greatness, but for the suffocating darkness he cast over an already broken nation. For behind his polished crown lay secrets, so grotesque, so unspeakable, that history itself has tried to erase them. Yet they linger, buried in fragments, in whispers, in the suffering of those who lived through his reign. And as the young Ferdinand grew into a man, the question was not whether he would fall into depravity. It was how far he would drag an entire kingdom with him into the abyss. Beyond the palace walls, Spain was a land of contradictions. Its rulers lived beneath golden ceilings, surrounded by silk and marble, while the streets outside were filled with beggars, soldiers without pay, and children with hollow eyes. The wealth of an empire, gold ripped from the Americas, silk stolen from the East, flowed into the hands of the few, while the masses lived with nothing but hunger and despair. In this fragile world, division was carved into every stone of society. Those of noble blood walked as though born above the law. Their skin, their titles, their ancestry elevated them into a realm untouchable by ordinary men and women. Below them, peasants toiled endlessly, their labor feeding a monarchy. that treated them as disposable. And below, even the peasants, those of foreign origin, mixed heritage, or darker skin, were branded with shame that could never be washed away. Spain had long justified its cruelty with faith and conquest, but by Ferdinand's era, it was nothing more than naked exploitation. A society where entire groups were denied humanity, indigenous peoples from the colonies, black slaves brought through the Atlantic trade, Jews and Muslims forced into conversion or exile. Their suffering was a quiet heartbeat beneath Spain's grand facade. The racism was not subtle. It was a tool, sharpened and wielded by those in power to keep their subjects divided, broken, and obedient. And Ferdinand watched this from his throne, not with pity, but with cold fascination. To him, the divisions were not injustices, but instruments. Each layer of society was another chain for him to tug, another lever of control. Where one man might see suffering and feel shame, Ferdinand saw opportunity. The oppressed could be crushed. Further, the silenced could be silenced forever. Their lives meant nothing in the shadow of his desires. The palace may have been the heart of Spain's corruption, but its sickness spread everywhere. In villages, women whispered prayers that their sons would not be taken for war. Farmers prayed for mercy from tax collectors who stripped them of the little grain they had. And everywhere, beneath the surface, resentment grew. Yet fear kept it shackled. The punishments for rebellion were swift, brutal, and designed to make examples. A man could lose his tongue for speaking against the king. A woman could lose her dignity for refusing the advances of his court. This was the Spain Ferdinand inherited, a kingdom where cruelty was not the exception, but the rule. A kingdom where human worth was measured in bloodlines and obedience. And it was in this fertile ground of oppression that Ferdinand's darkest appetites took root. He did not invent Spain's racism and inequality, he merely perfected their use, twisting them into tools of both governance and personal satisfaction. The people who suffered most under this system would never see justice. Their pain was invisible, erased from the grand narratives written by historians who served the crown, but their voices remain, like whispers buried in the dust of time. Servants forced into submission, minorities treated as less than animals, peasants crushed beneath taxes to fund royal excess. All of them were victims not only of a broken system, but of a king who reveled in their helplessness. And as his reign grew darker, Ferdinand would transform these injustices from silent suffering into outright terror. The divisions of Spain were no longer simply social, they became the theater of his cruelty. To the world beyond Spain's borders, Ferdinand VII was often painted as a symbol of stability. Monarchs and foreign dignitaries spoke his name as though he were a guardian of tradition, a man destined to restore Spain to its former glory. He played the role well. His portraits showed him draped in royal robes, his expression stoic, his crown a glittering emblem of authority. But the man behind the image was no savior. He was an actor wearing a mask, and beneath that mask lived a hunger that would soon devour everything around him. The mask of Ferdinand was carefully crafted. Public ceremonies were grand spectacles designed to project strength and piety. He appeared at cathedrals with bowed head and clasped hands, as though humility guided his soul. He greeted nobles with the stiff courtesy of a man who seemed to carry the weight of empire with dignity. For the common people, he offered empty promises, relief from taxes, protection from invaders, and a future where Spain's glory would return. His speeches painted him as a king chosen by God to heal a wounded land. But behind palace doors, the truth was very different. Ferdinand was consumed not with rebuilding Spain, but with feeding his paranoia. Every smile from a minister was interpreted as betrayal. Every ally was treated as a potential enemy. He changed advisors as often as one might change garments, dismissing and punishing those who dared to speak with honesty. In his mind, loyalty was not earned through wisdom or service, but through fear. And fear became the foundation of his rule. Courtiers lowered their eyes when he passed, terrified that even a glance might be misinterpreted. Servants moved like ghosts, trained to anticipate his moods lest they face his wrath. No one in the palace truly lived. They existed only to keep Ferdinand's fragile mask intact. Yet it was not only paranoia that drove him. The mask also hid the darker whispers of his private life, the obsessions and indulgences that history would later struggle to erase. Whispers circulated through the corridors of young women forced into silence, of twisted appetites that no crown could justify, of perversions that shocked even those accustomed to royal excess. These stories were rarely spoken aloud, for those who dared to reveal too much often vanished, swallowed by the shadows of the court. The contradictions of Ferdinand's rule spread outward like ripples in water. To the people, he was both king and predator. To the church, he was both a defender of faith and a man whose sins mocked the very God he claimed to serve. To his allies, he was both partner and threat, and to his enemies, he was not feared for his strength, but for his unpredictability. The mask could not hold forever. With each passing year, the cracks grew wider. His public image of order was undermined by his private life of chaos. His promises of protection rang hollow as oppression deepened. And the people, once silent, began to sense the truth, that their king was not a savior, but a curse. The stage was set. Ferdinand's mask was slipping, and behind it lay the full horror of a man whose hunger for control, perversion, and domination knew no limits. What began as whispers would soon erupt into screams, and the world would be forced to witness the darkest depths of his reign. The mask had begun to slip. What once was whispered in corners now spilled into the open, staining the image of Ferdinand with undeniable shadows. Spain's people, already drowning in hunger and despair, began to feel the king's cruelty pressed down on them like a suffocating weight. His rule, once dressed in ceremonial grandeur, was now raw, exposed, and terrifying. Ferdinand no longer cared to hide behind illusion. His paranoia demanded spectacles of power, public demonstrations of dominance designed to silence doubt and crush resistance before it could even form. Villages were forced to watch as men were dragged into squares and punished for crimes they had not committed, their bodies left broken as warnings. Women who resisted the advances of nobles or soldiers were humiliated openly, their dignity stripped away in front of neighbors who dared not speak. Children grew up not knowing joy, but learning the art of silence, their laughter stolen by the fear that even innocence could provoke wrath. The cruelty was not random, it was deliberate, methodical. Ferdinand wielded racism as both weapon and justification. Those of darker skin, mixed heritage, or colonial blood were treated as less than human, scapegoated for Spain's failings, used as examples of what happened to the disobedient. The king's decrees made their lives unbearable. Higher taxes, harsher punishments, fewer rights. Guards patrolled with unchecked power, choosing victims not for guilt, but for the color of their skin, the cut of their clothes, or the weakness in their eyes. And Ferdinand watched it all with satisfaction. To him, this was order. To him, the suffering of the many was proof of his strength. The more they bent, the more he believed his throne was secure. His court was no longer a place of quiet scheming. It became a theater of cruelty, where each minister, soldier, or servant performed their role in his twisted spectacle. Loyalty was measured not by service, but by willingness to enforce his brutality without hesitation. The palace corridors that once whispered now stood silent, not because fear had lessened, but because it had consumed everything. Servants no longer gossiped. They moved like shadows, terrified their words would be twisted into accusations. Nobles laughed too loudly at Ferdinand's cruel jokes, masking their disgust with applause, for they knew that even a flicker of disapproval could mark them for ruin. Ministers who dared to speak truth vanished overnight, their estates seized, their families left to beg in the streets. Spain itself groaned under the weight of this tyranny. The fields lay barren from neglect, for farmers refused to plant what would only be stolen. The cities swelled with beggars, men crippled by war and women widowed by hunger. The empire's colonies seethed with rebellion, their voices growing louder each year. And yet Ferdinand cared nothing for the cries of his people. He was not a king who ruled for the kingdom. He was a king who ruled only for himself. It was, in this atmosphere of fear and decay, that Ferdinand's perversions grew bolder. No longer content to hide them behind heavy curtains, he indulged openly, forcing courtiers and servants alike into silence through threats and violence. The whispers that once trembled through palace walls became truths too dangerous to deny. Yet no one dared to speak them aloud. To expose Ferdinand was to invite death, and so the kingdom lived in suffocating complicity, trapped in a nightmare with no waking. But beneath the silence, something stirred. The peasants who bowed their heads in the fields carried seeds of anger in their hearts. The soldiers who enforced the king's decrees whispered doubts among themselves when no ears were near. The Hior nobles, though bound by fear, began to wonder how long their fortunes could survive under a monarch who seemed determined to destroy the very foundations of Spain. The rising action of Ferdinand's reign was not just his cruelty, but the tension it had created, a kingdom stretched to its breaking point, its people caught between silence and revolt. Every lash of the whip, every humiliation, every whispered injustice was a spark, and Spain was becoming a field of dry grass waiting for flame. And Ferdinand, blinded by arrogance and hunger, piled the kindling higher with each passing day. Palace, once a fortress of secrets, no longer bothered to hide its horrors. What had once been veiled by ceremony and illusion was now paraded openly, as if Ferdinand took pride in exposing the rot of his rule. His paranoia had consumed him, and with it came a recklessness that stripped away even the pretense of dignity. Every corner of Spain now bore the scars of his reign. In the countryside, farmers abandoned their fields, their harvests stolen year after year by soldiers who claimed the grain in the king's name. In the cities, beggars crowded the streets, their hands outstretched not only for food, but for mercy. Yet none was given. To be poor was to be guilty. To be of darker skin or foreign blood was to be condemned, and to be accused, even falsely, was to be broken publicly, for Ferdinand demanded displays of punishment as proof of his power. No one was untouchable anymore. Even nobles who once feasted at the king's table found themselves dragged into disgrace if their loyalty wavered. Ministers who had spent decades serving the crown were accused of treason with no evidence, their wealth confiscated, their families destroyed. Soldiers who hesitated at his commands were whipped or executed in front of their comrades. Ferdinand's court had become a stage where fear was the only performance, and everyone was an actor forced to play their part or be replaced. And still the king's private appetites grew more grotesque. His indulgences no longer whispered but shouted, his perversions displayed, with a cruelty that silenced even the boldest voices. Young women were coerced into the palace and vanished into silence. Servants were broken under the weight of humiliation. His obsessions were not merely personal sins, they were spectacles of power, designed to remind all who watched that Ferdinand was untouchable. To resist was to vanish, to speak was to die. But outside the palace gates, the people's silence was beginning to fracture. The peasants who once bowed in fear now muttered curses under their breath. The soldiers who once enforced his cruelty began to question the worth of their service. The colonies, already restless, flared with new defiance. Across Spain, resentment was no longer a whisper. It was a roar, waiting to be unleashed. Ferdinand, blinded by arrogance, could not see it. To him, rebellion was unthinkable, for he believed his throne divinely ordained. Each act of cruelty, each humiliation he inflicted, was in his mind a proof of strength. But in truth, he was piling stones on his own coffin. The kingdom was a dam straining under pressure, and every injustice was another crack in the wall. The tension was unbearable. The courtiers lived in terror of the king's rage. The nobles feared the ruin of their fortunes. The people starved in silence, and the soldiers grew restless with doubts. Spain had become a nation standing on the edge of collapse, its future teetering between submission and uprising. And then came the moment when the world would no longer look away. Ferdinand's depravity, his paranoia, and his cruelty had reached their zenith. The stage was no longer set for whispers, but for an explosion. The climax of his reign was inevitable, and the kingdom was about to burn with the weight of his sins. The storm could no longer be contained. Spain, once silent beneath the weight of fear, had reached its breaking point. Ferdinand had ruled through cruelty, fed on suffering and demanded obedience at any cost. But now his kingdom itself was turning against him. The palace was no longer a sanctuary. Its golden halls echoed with unrest. Ministers who once bowed in loyalty whispered treachery behind closed doors. Soldiers, exhausted from carrying out brutal commands, turned their eyes toward the people. They had once suppressed, and for the first time, they saw themselves not as enforcers, but as fellow prisoners of tyranny. Ferdinand, blind to the shifting ground beneath him, doubled down on cruelty. His punishments grew more grotesque, his paranoia more violent. He accused his closest allies of betrayal, imprisoning them without trial, stripping families of wealth, and ordering executions with the flick of a hand. What was once fear now became disgust, and disgust soon turned to hatred. The streets of Spain erupted. Villages that had suffered in silence for decades now rose in fury. Farmers who had surrendered their harvests marched with scythes and pitchforks. Beggars who once trembled in corners shouted curses against the king. Even nobles, ruined by his greed, turned their fortunes to fund rebellion. The oppressed, peasants, soldiers, minorities, women, long silenced, found a single unifying truth. Their enemy was not each other, but the man who ruled them. The rebellion spread like fire through dry fields. Cities became battlegrounds. Villages became strongholds, and the empire that had once stretched across oceans now seemed incapable of protecting its own crown. Ferdinand's name, once spoken with trembling obedience, became a curse spat into the wind. Inside the palace, the walls closed in. Courtiers fled under cover of night. Ministers abandoned their posts, and servants disappeared rather than endure one more day of humiliation. Ferdinand raged like a caged beast, issuing decrees that no one obeyed, demanding loyalty from a court that no longer existed. The mask he had worn for so long was gone. What remained was the raw, twisted figure of a king stripped of illusions. In the end, Ferdinand was left alone with the echoes of his sins. The very system of racism and cruelty he had perfected now turned against him, for the people he had dehumanized were no longer silent. They had risen and they demanded justice. His reign, built on suffering, collapsed beneath the weight of its own horror. And as the kingdom burned with the fury of rebellion, one truth became clear. Ferdinand VII would not be remembered as a savior, nor even as a king. He would be remembered as a curse upon his people, a symbol of perversion and tyranny, whose darkness could not outlast the fire of those who finally stood against him. The tyrant was gone, but his shadow lingered. Ferdinand's death did not bring silence. It left behind echoes of suffering that haunted Spain long after his body was laid in the earth. For years he had reigned with cruelty, stripping dignity from his people, feeding on their fear, and dividing them by race, class, and bloodline. Now those divisions remained like scars carved into the nation's flesh. The peasants returned to their fields, but the soil had grown heavy with blood. Families who had buried their children beneath the weight of hunger could not forget the years of starvation. Soldiers who once carried out orders now carried guilt, their memories poisoned by the screams of those they had silenced. The palace, once a monument to royal power, stood as a hollow reminder of corruption, a mausoleum of gold where every room whispered of the crimes committed within. And yet amidst the ruins, there was a spark of hope. The rebellion that had risen against Ferdinand had not been in vain. It had proven that silence could be broken, that even the most perverted of kings could not rule forever. The people had found their voice, and once raised, it could not easily be silenced again. But history is cruel. Ferdinand's reign became a warning etched into Spain's memory, a reminder of how power, when twisted by greed and racism, can consume not only a ruler, but an entire nation. He had believed himself immortal, yet he became mortal in the worst way, not through glory, but through infamy. His name was cursed, his legacy stained, his memory reviled. Centuries later, his story remains, not as a tale of triumph, but as a question that still lingers. How many lives must be destroyed before a people decide they have suffered enough? How much cruelty must one nation endure before it rises against its own chains? The most perverted king in history left behind no lessons of leadership, no wisdom, no honor. only this truth: when cruelty is allowed to reign unchecked, it devours everything, until even kings are swallowed by the darkness they themselves unleashed.